Welcome to this remarkable war survival chronicle, where forgotten civilian wisdom met the collapse of armies and nations. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time this story found you. These quiet war stories often travel farther than battles ever did. The discovery came in 1967 when county workers demolishing a condemned farmhouse 40 miles from the Oregon coast found something unexpected. Behind a loose wall panel wrapped in oiled cloth lay 17 handwritten pages, a collection of sketched diagrams, and what appeared to be a coded message system. The papers bore the name Isolde Ravenscroft, dated between October 1942 and March 1945. No official military record mentioned her name. No veteran registry listed her techniques. Yet these documents would reveal one of the most ingenious civilian survival strategies of the Pacific Coast defense period. The farmhouse itself told a story of gradual abandonment, paint peeled from wooden siding, weathered by 22 years of coastal storms. Windows had been boarded shut from the inside using planks cut to precise measurements. The roof showed evidence of careful repair work, with patches of different materials suggesting systematic maintenance over several years. Most unusually, the property contained structures that served no obvious agricultural purpose: wooden platforms positioned at specific compass bearings, shallow trenches dug in geometric patterns, and metal stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals. Isolde Ravenscroft's husband, Staff Sergeant Matthias Ravenscroft, had been killed at Pearl Harbor aboard the USS Arizona on December 7, 1941. By spring 1942, she found herself alone on their isolated timber property, 43 miles from the nearest town, with no telephone, no neighbors within walking distance, and no reliable transportation. The coastal region had been declared a military zone. German U-boats had been spotted offshore. Japanese submarine attacks had struck California and Oregon. Civilian evacuations were recommended but not mandatory for properties beyond the immediate beach zones. The couple had purchased the 280-acre property in 1938, intending to establish a small logging operation. The land included mature Douglas fir stands, a natural spring, and several outbuildings from previous homesteading attempts. Matthias had planned to clear selective timber plots while maintaining the forest canopy for erosion control. Isolde had managed the financial records and supply coordination skills that would prove critical during her isolation. But what few knew that winter was that Isolde possessed something unusual: a working knowledge of railroad signaling systems, learned during 2 years of employment with the Southern Pacific Railway before her marriage. This seemingly mundane skill would become the foundation of her survival strategy. Her railway work had involved coordinating train movements through mountain passes, where visual signals were critical for preventing collisions. She understood how to communicate complex information using simple, light patterns, flag positions, and timing sequences. The first documented entry in her hidden journal, dated October 15, 1942, reads, "No mail truck for 11 days. Radio reports submarine sighting 20 miles north. Last of the potatoes gone. Must make this work." What follows is a detailed description of a deception technique that would keep enemy reconnaissance teams confused about the true nature of her isolated property for nearly 3 years. The technique was elegantly simple. Using strips of white cloth, pieces of broken mirror, and carefully timed lantern signals, Isolde created the illusion that her remote farmhouse was actually an active military installation. She had observed that enemy scouts, whether submarine-based or potential saboteurs, relied on visual reconnaissance from distant vantage points. They looked for patterns of activity, light discipline, and military-style movement. Instead of hiding, she chose to misdirect. Her understanding of enemy psychology proved remarkably sophisticated. German and Japanese reconnaissance protocols emphasized identifying civilian versus military targets through observation of daily routines. Military installations followed predictable schedules for guard changes, communication checks, and supply activities. Civilian properties showed irregular patterns of activity based on individual needs rather than systematic operations. By mimicking military scheduling, Isolde could convince distant observers that her property was strategically important enough to avoid rather than investigate. Every evening at precisely 1847 hours, she would position a white cloth strip on her southeastern fence post. This remained visible until dawn, when she moved it to the northwestern corner of her property. The timing matched standard military guard rotation schedules. The positioning suggested radio antenna placement to distant observers using binoculars or periscope observations. The property appeared to follow military protocols. The cloth strips themselves were carefully prepared for maximum visibility and durability. Isolde cut them from white bed sheets, creating pieces exactly 18 inches long and 4 inches wide. She treated each strip with pine sap to waterproof the fabric against coastal moisture. The strips were attached to wooden stakes using specific knot patterns that mimicked military field communication standards. From a distance of 2 miles, the maximum effective range of standard reconnaissance equipment, the strips appeared identical to official signal flags. The mirror fragments served a different purpose. Placed strategically on her roof and in windows, they caught and reflected sunlight in patterns that mimicked the flash of optical surveillance equipment. Enemy observers, expecting to conduct reconnaissance without being detected, would see evidence that they were being watched in return. This psychological pressure consistently forced them to retreat to more distant observation points, reducing the effectiveness of their intelligence gathering. Isolde positioned 12 mirror fragments around her property, each one angled to reflect sunlight toward specific compass bearings where enemy observation posts were most likely to be established. She calculated the reflection angles using geometry learned during her railway work, where precise signal positioning was critical for mountain pass operations. The mirrors were fragments from a large bathroom mirror broken systematically to create pieces of optimal size for long-distance reflection. Her lantern signals represented the most sophisticated element of the deception. Using knowledge gained from her railroad work, Isolde created false communication patterns that suggested regular contact with military command structures. 3 distinct signal sequences, repeated on rotation, indicated different fictional message types: supply status reports, personnel changes, and security alerts. The signals were visible from offshore positions but required no actual radio equipment or military coordination. The first sequence consisted of 3 short flashes followed by 2 long flashes, repeated 5 times with 30-second intervals. This pattern suggested routine supply acknowledgement signals. The second sequence used 2 short flashes, 1 long flash, and 3 short flashes repeated 3 times with 15-second intervals, indicating personnel status updates. The third sequence employed continuous flashing for 45 seconds, followed by complete darkness for 2 minutes, suggesting security alert conditions. Each sequence required precise timing to maintain credibility. Isolde used a mechanical pocket watch inherited from her husband to ensure accuracy. The watch had been regulation equipment for railway operations, designed to maintain precision under field conditions. She wound the watch every evening at sunset and checked its accuracy against radio time announcements to prevent timing drift that might alert enemy observers to the deception. During winter months, when enemy activity along the coast intensified, Isolde expanded the deception. She maintained multiple sets of footprints around her property, suggesting the presence of a full security detail. This required precise planning. Each morning, she walked 3 different routes using varying stride lengths and boot impressions. She created rest areas where multiple people might pause during patrols. She even established false waste disposal sites consistent with military field sanitation requirements. Creating convincing multiple footprint patterns demanded extraordinary attention to detail. Isolde owned 3 different pairs of boots, her own work boots, Matthias's military boots, and a pair of civilian boots purchased before the war. She also modified her walking style to create footprints suggesting different body weights and walking patterns. The first route covered the property perimeter, suggesting standard security patrols. The second route connected key buildings, indicating personnel movement between duty stations. The third route led to the false waste disposal areas and supply storage locations. The physical demands were considerable. Maintaining the deception required her to be active before dawn and after sunset every day for 31 months. She could never rest from the routine. Missing even one signal sequence might alert enemy observers that the installation was undermanned or compromised. The psychological pressure was equally challenging. She lived with the constant awareness that discovery would likely result in capture or death. Food procurement became her secondary survival challenge. Cut off from regular supply deliveries, Isolde relied entirely on stored provisions and what she could harvest from the surrounding forest. Her journal documents systematic rationing: 4 ounces of flour daily, 2 ounces of dried beans, 1 cup of preserved vegetables. She supplemented this with wild berries, edible roots, and fish caught from a nearby creek, using improvised equipment. The property's original homesteaders had left behind a substantial root cellar, which Isolde expanded and improved for long-term food storage. The cellar maintained a constant temperature of 48 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, ideal for preserving dried goods and preventing spoilage. She lined the walls with additional insulation using pine boughs and created separate storage areas for different food types to prevent contamination. Her fishing equipment consisted entirely of improvised materials. She created hooks from safety pins, straightened and bent into shape. Fishing line came from unraveled hemp rope found in the property's tool shed. She constructed a simple net using strips of cloth woven into a mesh pattern. The creek contained native trout and seasonal salmon runs, providing protein sources that required no ammunition or noise that might compromise her deception. The most critical resource was fuel for her signal lantern. Kerosene supplies dwindled rapidly during the first winter. Her solution involved extracting oil from pine pitch, a technique she learned by studying old logging camp manuals found in her property's previous structures. The process was labor-intensive but sustainable. Pine pitch could be harvested year-round without depleting local resources. Pine pitch oil extraction required specific procedures to ensure clean-burning fuel. Isolde collected pitch from Douglas fir trees, focusing on natural wounds and branch joints where pitch accumulated naturally. She heated the pitch in a metal container over a controlled fire, allowing the oil to separate and collect in a second container. The process yielded approximately 2 ounces of usable oil from 1 pound of raw pitch. The resulting fuel burned with a steady, bright flame suitable for signaling purposes. Water posed no immediate problem. Her property included a natural spring that provided consistent flow throughout the year. However, she couldn't risk using normal collection methods, which might alert enemy observers to the true number of people on the property. Instead, she developed a collection system using concealed channels and buried storage containers that suggested military-grade water security measures. The water collection system involved digging a series of trenches connecting the spring to several buried containers positioned around the property. She covered the trenches with wooden planks and dirt, creating concealed water distribution that appeared consistent with military installation design. The buried containers were large metal drums salvaged from previous homesteading operations, each capable of storing 50 gallons of water. Winter 1943 brought the most severe test of her deception strategy. Heavy snowfall made it impossible to maintain multiple walking routes around the property. Enemy reconnaissance would notice the reduction in activity patterns. Isolde's solution was to create false shelter structures suggesting that personnel had consolidated into winter quarters. She used branches, snow, and cloth to build convincing decoy positions while maintaining her signal routine from a single heated location. The false shelter construction demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Isolde built 5 separate structures positioned around her property, each designed to suggest different military functions. 2 structures appeared to be guard positions, constructed with firing ports and concealed observation windows. 2 others mimicked supply storage areas with false entrances and ventilation systems. The 5th structure was designed as a command post, featuring antenna supports and communication equipment housings. Each structure required regular maintenance to remain convincing under enemy observation. Snow accumulation had to be managed to suggest ongoing occupancy. Footprint patterns had to be maintained around each structure despite limited personnel. Isolde developed techniques for creating false occupancy signs using heated metal objects to melt selective snow patches, suggesting body heat signatures visible to distant observers. The psychological toll of isolation appears clearly in journal entries from this period. Day 127 without human contact, she wrote in February 1943. Voices from radio still working. Must keep believing help exists somewhere. The radio, a battery-powered civilian model, provided her only connection to the outside world. She carefully conserved battery power, listening only to essential news broadcasts and emergency information. Radio battery conservation became a critical survival skill. Isolde limited radio use to 15 minutes daily, focusing on weather reports and military news that might affect enemy activity levels. She learned to recognize the most important information quickly, taking written notes to avoid repeat listening sessions. When batteries began failing, she discovered methods for extending their life using controlled warming and strategic rest periods. By spring 1943, Isolde had refined her techniques to an extraordinary degree of sophistication. She had developed 17 different signal variations that could communicate complex false information about troop movements, supply deliveries, and security status changes. She had created a maintenance schedule for her deception equipment that ensured consistent performance while minimizing resource consumption. Most importantly, she had learned to think like the enemy reconnaissance teams, anticipating their observation methods and information requirements. The expanded signal variations allowed Isolde to suggest specific military activities that would justify the continued presence of her fictional installation. Weather-dependent signals indicated supply delivery schedules affected by coastal conditions. Personnel signals suggested rotating assignments and temporary duty changes. Emergency signals indicated security concerns that would justify increased defensive measures. Understanding enemy reconnaissance psychology became her greatest advantage. Isolde realized that enemy observers were looking for specific information patterns that would help them classify targets for future military action. By providing consistent false information that suggested a heavily defended position, she ensured that her property would be classified as a target requiring significant resources to attack, making it a low priority for immediate action. The technique proved its effectiveness repeatedly. Post-war German naval records, declassified in 1963, contained 3 separate reports describing heavily defended installation 40 miles inland from Oregon coast. Estimated strength 20 to 30 personnel. Sophisticated communication equipment, active from October 1942 through spring 1945. No such installation ever existed. Japanese reconnaissance reports discovered in captured documents from submarine operations provide additional confirmation of the deception's success. One report, dated March 1944, specifically mentions consistent enemy signals from inland position, suggests radar or radio facility, recommend avoid area for landing operations. The recommendation effectively protected not only Isolde's property, but the entire surrounding region from enemy infiltration attempts. But what sustained Isolde through these months of complete isolation was not just technical skill, but a profound understanding of human nature under pressure. She knew that enemy reconnaissance teams, like all soldiers, would see what they expected to see. By providing convincing evidence of their preconceived expectations, she could control their decision-making processes without them realizing they were being manipulated. Her journal reveals sophisticated psychological insights that would have impressed professional intelligence analysts. "Enemy looks for patterns that confirm what they already believe," she wrote in April 1943. "Give them those patterns, and they stop questioning. Make them think they understand what they are seeing, and they will see what you want them to think they understand." This psychological understanding extended to her own mental health management. Isolde recognized that prolonged isolation could compromise her judgment and effectiveness. She developed structured daily routines that maintained mental discipline while preserving psychological stability. Morning activities focused on physical maintenance tasks. Afternoon work involved technical improvements to her deception systems. Evening periods were reserved for planning and journal writing. The end came gradually. As Allied forces gained control of the Pacific shipping lanes, enemy reconnaissance activity decreased significantly. By March 1945, Isolde's journal entries suggest she was considering abandoning the deception routine. The final entry, dated March 18, 1945, reads simply, "No signals offshore for 47 days. War moving away. Time to become human again." Recovery workers found evidence of her departure in late March 1945. The signal equipment had been carefully dismantled and hidden. The false shelter structures were collapsed and scattered. The walking routes were deliberately obscured. She had left no trace that might compromise other isolated civilians using similar techniques. The hidden documents were her only remaining communication with the outside world. The careful dismantling of her deception systems demonstrated the same systematic thinking that had created them. Every piece of equipment was either destroyed or concealed to prevent discovery by subsequent occupants or investigators. The mirror fragments were buried in separate locations around the property. The cloth signal strips were burned completely. The false structures were dismantled and their materials scattered to appear like natural debris. Attempts to locate Isolde Ravenscroft after the war proved unsuccessful. No death certificate exists in Oregon state records. No marriage certificate indicates remarriage. No Social Security records show employment after 1945. The county clerk who processed the property demolition in 1967, Arthur Voss, noted that neighbors had no memory of her return after the war ended. The property had remained abandoned until its demolition 22 years later. The search for Isolde involved multiple government agencies and civilian organizations. The Veterans Administration conducted extensive searches of their records, finding no references to her as a dependent or survivor. The Internal Revenue Service found no tax records after 1944. The Social Security Administration showed no benefit claims or employment records. It was as if she had deliberately erased all official traces of her existence. Private investigators hired by Dr. Margaret Thornfield in 1968 extended the search to other states, focusing on areas where war widows commonly relocated after 1945. They found no matches for her name or description in California, Washington, Idaho, or Nevada records. Hospital admissions, employment records, voter registrations, and property purchases showed no trace of Isolde Ravenscroft anywhere in the western United States. The documents found in 1967 were transferred to the Oregon State Historical Society, where they remained largely unexamined until 1969. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, a researcher studying civilian contributions to wartime defense, recognized the significance of the materials. Her analysis confirmed that the techniques described were both practical and innovative, representing a unique application of railway signaling knowledge to military deception. Dr. Thornfield's comprehensive analysis required 18 months of investigation and verification. She consulted military intelligence experts, railway signaling specialists, and wartime reconnaissance veterans to confirm the technical accuracy of Isolde's methods. Every aspect of the deception strategy was tested and proven effective under laboratory conditions. Independent experts concluded that the techniques would have successfully fooled enemy reconnaissance teams using 1940s technology. The verification process included field testing of the signaling methods using period-appropriate equipment. Military historians recreated the observation conditions that enemy reconnaissance teams would have experienced, testing the visibility and credibility of Isolde's signals from distances of 2 to 5 miles. The results confirmed that the deception would have been completely convincing to observers using standard wartime surveillance equipment. Dr. Thornfield's report, filed with the Department of Defense Historical Research Division, emphasized several critical aspects of the case. First, the deception strategy required no special equipment, extensive training, or coordination with military authorities. Second, the psychological principles involved were sound and transferable to other scenarios. Third, the resource management techniques demonstrated exceptional efficiency under extreme constraint conditions. The Department of Defense evaluation included recommendations for incorporating Isolde's techniques into civilian defense training programs. However, by 1969, military strategic priorities had shifted toward nuclear warfare scenarios where individual civilian deception techniques were considered less relevant. The recommendations were filed without implementation, though copies were distributed to allies studying unconventional warfare methods. The implications extended beyond individual survival. If one isolated civilian could successfully deceive enemy reconnaissance for nearly 3 years, similar techniques could be taught to other vulnerable populations. The coastal defense strategy during World War II had focused primarily on military installations and major population centers. Isolated civilians had received minimal protection or preparation guidance. More significantly, Isolde's story revealed the broader human capacity for adaptation under extreme circumstances. Her survival depended not on superior physical strength, advanced technology, or extensive resources. Instead, she succeeded through careful observation, systematic thinking, and absolute consistency in execution. These qualities were available to any civilian willing to develop them. The moral lesson embedded in these discovered documents speaks to fundamental questions about preparation, improvisation, and human resilience. Isolde Ravenscroft possessed no special advantages when her world collapsed around her. She faced the same isolation, resource scarcity, and physical danger as thousands of other civilians during the war. The difference lay in her decision to transform knowledge gained during peacetime employment into an instrument of survival. Her railway signaling background would have seemed irrelevant to military defense. Few people in 1942 could have predicted that understanding train communication systems would become useful for deceiving submarine reconnaissance teams. This suggests that survival often depends not on acquiring specialized military skills, but on developing the ability to adapt existing knowledge to unexpected circumstances. The consistency of her deception routine demonstrates the critical importance of systematic thinking under pressure. For 31 months, Isolde maintained complex signal patterns without deviation or failure. This level of precision required extraordinary self-discipline, but the knowledge involved was fundamentally simple. She succeeded because she understood that effective deception depends more on reliability than complexity. Perhaps most importantly, her story illustrates the value of preparation that extends beyond material stockpiling. Isolde survived not because she hoarded vast quantities of food, fuel, or equipment, but because she developed mental habits that enabled effective decision-making under stress. She learned to think systematically about resource allocation, threat assessment, and long-term sustainability. The documents found in 1967 provide no information about Isolde's eventual fate or her reasons for disappearing after the war ended. Dr. Thornfield's research team conducted extensive interviews with Pacific Northwest veterans and civilian survivors, but found no one who remembered meeting her or hearing her story. She had chosen to vanish as completely as she had chosen to survive. This absence of conclusion may represent the most significant aspect of her legacy. Isolde Ravenscroft's survival techniques were preserved not for recognition or reward, but to provide guidance for others who might face similar circumstances. The hidden documents suggest a woman who understood that individual survival stories matter less than the knowledge they contain. The Oregon State Historical Society maintains these materials in their World War II Civilian Experience Collection, though they receive few research requests. The techniques Isolde developed remain as practical today as they were during wartime. The principles of systematic deception, resource management, and psychological resilience apply equally to natural disasters, economic collapse, or social breakdown. Her story reminds us that civilian survival often depends more on intellectual preparation than physical strength. It suggests that ordinary knowledge, carefully applied, can overcome extraordinary challenges. Most importantly, it demonstrates that individual actions, however isolated, can create lasting value for others facing similar struggles. The white cloth strips, mirror fragments, and signal lanterns that fooled enemy reconnaissance teams for 3 years were never recovered. They had served their purpose and been discarded, but the knowledge behind them, preserved in 17 handwritten pages, continues to offer guidance for anyone who must face the collapse of normal life and find a way to endure. In wartime and peace, some victories remain invisible to those who win them. Isolde Ravenscroft spent 31 months proving that individual intelligence, systematic preparation, and absolute consistency can triumph over superior force and numbers. Her greatest achievement may have been recognizing that this knowledge was worth preserving, even if she herself chose to disappear into history.